I'm Del Reisman. We're sitting here in the library of the Writers Guild Foundation in Los Angeles. Hal Kanter is our guest, and Hal, among other things, has been writing for many, many years and is now really an ambassador to the industry, the entertainment industry. And you've been doing this for many years. You've been toastmasting. You've been appearing at many, many places, introducing people, tributes, awards, the Academy Award show, the Directors Guild, the Writers Guild, the USC Scripter Award. So many of these events, you offer yourself as a marvelous host, and it becomes that. It becomes kind of an ambassador, really.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah,
because a great deal of what I do and say, I do with some degree of sincerity.
Of course.
How I got into it, I believe it started shortly after the war, when a group of writers got together and had a surprise celebration for one of our members whose wife was about to give birth to a child. I guess it was a sort of a bachelor, not a bachelor, what do you call it?
Yeah.
What do you call that when a group of people get together to celebrate the birth of a child? You know, it's not a shower. Anyway,
a festival, an event.
A festival of some sort,
Yeah.
yes. And all of the writers were asked to get up and say a few words. And evidently what I had to say was of some interest to those people. They said that the following month, Sherwood Schwartz's was about to give, his wife was about to give birth to their first child. And they asked me to officiate at another one of those things. And I did, and I enjoyed it very much, and
Sure.
evidently they enjoyed it, and that's how it started.
Yeah.
So we can blame it all on Sherwood Schwartz.
And his baby.
And his baby, yeah. His baby Don, who's now a doctor.
Right. For many, many years, you have been on the writing staff and head writer of the annual Academy Award broadcast.
True.
Which is an extraordinary presentation because most of it is live. Mm-hmm. And it harkens back to the live television days when if somebody tripped and fell, they tripped and fell. There was no taking it over. And although they're film clips, film inserts, there's a certain amount of tape and so on, essentially it's a live show. What is that? What is that experience like? You've got Academy Award presenters, famous stars.
It's sometimes very rewarding. Most often it's very frustrating. The Academy Awards show is usually not written, it's rewritten. We're constantly making changes as the various stars get their script. Some of them are very unhappy with what they're asked to say. Sometimes their press agents are unhappy and cause the star in turn to become unhappy. And so we're constantly rewriting to satisfy egos of a lot of people. I found over the years that the people who accept what is written for them are usually people who are smarter, people who have more confidence in themselves, and people who have a better sense of humor than most actors.
Right.
It can be, on the other hand, a very rewarding experience to realize that what you're saying is being seen and heard immediately by nearly 1 billion people around the world. Yeah. So you get a little sense of power there, which doesn't last very long, I must admit.
What happens, I know you can't control what somebody says on a live show, but every once in a while there's a political comment. Somebody sort of puts everything aside, comes out as a presenter, and then makes a very strong pitch, which may be a noble comment about some political cause, but it's just thrust in there.
Yes, but it usually is very rude of them to do that because they're taking time from other people who have something to say too. Yeah. That's not a place to, I think, to make political comments. usually they come from people who have axes to grind, and they don't ask anybody's permission. They don't say anything to anybody on the staff of the show, and they go out and thrust themselves in front of the public and to make their speeches. I feel that's very rude on their part. They should not do that.
Yeah, yeah. Very good.
But now, when people win an award and they come up, we have no control at all over what they say, and usually they're speaking from their heart. Yeah. And usually the acceptance speeches that people remember are the ones that have some wit to them. Yeah. And some sincerity to them.
Yeah, yeah. Very good. The Academy Award show is in March every year. How long?
March and April. Yeah.
March and April. How long is the preparation? When do you begin?
We really begin writing after the nominees have been announced.
And that's about the 1st of February, somewhere in there?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
The end of January.
So it's a long, intensive...
Yeah, we usually spend about, maybe about 6 weeks on the show, I think.
Yeah. And how many writers are with you, Hal?
Sometimes there was one year I did it alone.
Yeah.
There are other times when there have been as many as 7 writers on one show.
Right. Do individual presenters, individual stars ask for a certain writer at times?
Occasionally that happens.
Yeah.
But usually the writers who have been asked to do the show are people who've already proven to actors that they know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And a lot of actors, of course, in the first, in the beginning of this, they had no idea what television was all about. And they just accepted the fact that the people who are writing the show knew what television was all about, which of course we did not know either.
The whole idea of being able to write this kind of material, which makes a presenter look good and makes a presenter look somewhat spontaneous and so on, is a result of years of writing. So I want to go back for a minute to the beginnings and your origin as a writer. You are from Savannah, Georgia, is that right?
That's true.
Savannah?
Savannah's right.
Yeah. Now, how in the world did someone from Savannah get started as a writer in the entertainment industry when there were hardly any textbooks out there? There was no availability of screenplays. There was very little film school activity. How did you get into this?
Well, first of all, I moved from Savannah. That's the first thing.
That's the first thing.
And now that I think about it, it was a very bad move because life in Savannah is so much more elegant, so much more leisurely than life here. Right. As a matter of fact, I was in Savannah last October, and in Savannah it was still September. That's how leisurely things are there. Anyway, I really began in radio. I started as a cartoonist writing jokes, and when I was a very, very young child. And when I found out that the editors felt that my drawing was not as professional as it should be, and they just would start to buy the ideas and farming out the artwork to others, I decided I could just write instead of taking the trouble to sit down and actually draw the cartoons themselves. So from writing cartoon jokes, I then got into writing radio jokes, and from radio I got into television. Right. And then from television into film. Yeah.
Now, what were some of the radio shows of the past that you worked on?
The first radio show that I ever wrote that got any kind of credit for was the Joe Penner show.
Oh, yes.
I remember at one point I was working with a man named Eddie Davis, who was a very famous comedy writer at that time. And I was really a junior writer in the closet almost, and I did a lot of typing for him. And one of the first chores that I got was working with him on a spot for Olson and Johnson on the Kate Smith radio hour. Now, Olson and Johnson at the time were big stars on Broadway in Hell's a Poppin'.
Right.
And they produced another show called Streets of Paris, and Streets of Paris was to feature another comedy team called Abbott and Costello.
Oh, yes.
And Abbott and Costello had suddenly done well by appearing on the Kate Smith Hour. And Ted Collins, who was the producer of Kate Smith, would allow Abbott and Costello to go to out of town for a tryout for the Streets of Paris, only if Olson and Johnson replaced them on the air. So Eddie Davis and I did the spot for Olson and Johnson. And we came in with a script to Ted Collins, and he went over it and approved a lot of it, but there was one joke in particular that he did not like. He said, change that joke. And Eddie Davis said, that's the biggest laugh in the whole show. He said, you can't do that. He was defending his property. And Ted said, I don't care if it's a big laugh. He said, I don't agree with you. I don't think it's funny. He said, what do you mean it's not funny? He said, he said, it's an old joke. He says, it's not an old joke. He said, ask the kid. He said, I wrote that joke last night, didn't I, Hal? And I said, as far as I know, yes. Yes, he just wrote it last night. And Collins said, I still don't like it. He says, take it out because it's not funny. And Eddie said, not funny. It's the biggest laugh Al Jolson ever got.
Now, what about...
Then sometime later, I was talking about how writers will defend their jokes. And Goody Ace made a very wise
that was
remark.
Goodman Ace.
Goodman Ace,
yeah.
The dean of all comedy writers. Goody said, never argue about a joke unless you're absolutely sure it's the last one you can write.
Abbott and Costello went on from there. Did they have a radio show?
I don't know if they did radio at that time or not.
Yeah.
I know that they did do the Kate Smith Hour for quite a while.
Right.
Another, talking about Kate Smith.
Yeah.
A couple of writers, I think Al Schwartz and another writer whose name I don't recall, were working here in Los Angeles. And they got a telegram, or Al got a telegram from Henny Youngman, another comic of that time. And Henny said, I have a shot on the Kate Smith show. He said, please send me, for old time's sake, one great opening joke. So Al was discussing this with his friend, his collaborator, and there was a man who was repairing the telephone in the office, and he began to laugh, and Al said, what's so funny? He said, I was working at Warner Brothers last week, or yesterday rather, fixing a phone. He says, and some guys in the office there got the same telegram from Henny Youngman. So Al said, that's very interesting. They made a few phone calls and found that Henny had sent a telegram to about 5 or 6 different writers that he knew out here. So they all got together and wrote one joke, and all of them wired the same joke to Henny collect.
Very good. The radio days were much looser, weren't they?
Much so. Yeah. Much more so, yes.
Yeah. And then you segued into television.
Right.
What were those early shows that you were writing on in television?
Television?
Yeah.
The first show we did was the first show that emanated from Los Angeles and went east live.
Right.
Although it didn't go live in those days because the coaxial cable didn't come in until a year or so later. But it was in 1948, I believe it was, 47, 48, we did the Ed Wynn Show.
Oh, gee.
It was a half-an-hour comedy.
Yeah, a great old vaudeville comic.
Great,
Yes.
Great star of the theater.
Yeah.
And he was equally amusing and funny on television too.
Yeah. Hal, did you write in collaboration with others at that time?
Yes.
Yeah.
The Ed Wynn Show I did with Seaman Jacobs.
Yeah.
And the late Leo Solomon.
Is writing with a partner better in comedy?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. Because when you have a collaborator in comedy, you have somebody you can blame it on.
You can also hear each other's jokes. I mean, you can laugh or not laugh.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, yeah. Did you stay with a partner for a long period of time, or did you have different?
No, I had a number of different partners.
Yeah,
there were several teams that worked together for years.
Yeah.
Wedlock and Snyder.
Oh yes.
Who, as a matter of fact, gave me my start in this business.
Right.
Howard Snyder did.
Right.
They were a team for like 35 years, I believe, before they broke up. I believe death is what broke them up.
That could do it. Did you, not long after that, didn't you go into producing?
I didn't start producing until, I believe, no, after I got out of films. I was doing films.
Oh, yes, yes.
And I wanted to, then I was asked to do the George Gobel television show.
Right, right.
And I took over the George Gobel show as a writer, director, and producer.
And that was, I wanted to say, the George Gobel show was probably the most popular television show in America for a period of a couple of seasons at least. It was a remarkable job.
He was a remarkable man. He was a remarkable comic.
Yeah.
It's interesting about the stuff that we did for George what was it, 20 years ago or what? I've forgotten how many years ago. Recently, I saw 2 or 3 of those shows, tapes, and they still hold up. They're just as funny now as they were then.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
And I can't say that about everything with it.
No, that was
including some films.
That was a memorable show. Did you do the George Gobel show after you had done some screen work?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Was that including the Tennessee Williams play, The Rose Tattoo?
I believe I did. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was after working with Tennessee Williams.
You had adapted the play The Rose Tattoo, this famous Broadway hit, to a movie.
Correct.
For Paramount, and that
for Hal Wallace. Yeah.
For Hal Wallace, and that was
who incidentally, let me say, for Hal Wallace, who to my mind was the best producer that this town ever had.
That's a great compliment. He was also the producer of Casablanca.
That's right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. How did you, as one who had been working in comedy, how did you wind up adapting Tennessee Williams?
Well, I had, at one point in my career in radio, I had done some radio drama. A gentleman who was producing the Joe Penner show said to me at the end of the season, he said, "Why do you waste your time on writing jokes for people like Joe Penner?" He says, "You're obviously a very bright young man." He said, "You should be doing something more serious." He said, "Now I'm going back to New York to produce a radio show called Grand Central Station, and I'd like you to come and see me, and maybe you can do some work for me." And I was very flattered by that. And I did indeed go back and do some radio dramas for him. I didn't realize at the time that doing comedy is a much more demanding discipline than radio drama or any kind of drama. You know, making people laugh is tougher than making them cry. Although a lot of what I've written has made people cry. Anyway, I was working for Wallace on a project, and his associate, Paul Nathan, asked me to read a script, which was written by Ketty Frings, and I read that, and I thought that she had missed a lot of the book. So I asked him, why are you asking me to read this? He said, because we want to do a rewrite on it. He said, and we have a director who's assigned to it. The director is Danny Mann. Mm-hmm. And I had a meeting with Danny and Wallace. And I had done several pictures for Wallace at that time. And at the time, I was also writing another Martin and Lewis comedy for him. Mm-hmm. And we met and we discussed my ideas of Mrs. Leslie. And I remember Danny Mann saying to Wallace, he said, you know, there are two kind of writers. There are writers who talk and there are writers who write. He said, he talks. He said, how does he write? And Wallace said, well, he's done a few pictures for me. He said, I tell you what, he said, why don't you go, he said, put aside what you're doing right now, the Martin and Lewis picture, and write a love scene for me, from Mrs. Leslie. I said, just one love scene? He said, yeah, just write it, just to show me that you could do that sort of thing. And I said, I'd really much rather start at the top and, you know, then you do a few. He said, no, just do one love scene, that's all. So I said, okay. So I got up and I started to leave, and I get to the door and I turned around and I said, just a minute. I said, you know, it occurred to me, Hal, it's true, I've only done comedies for you, and that's all you've produced for me was comedies. How do I know you can produce a love scene? And he looked at me like I was crazy. I thought Paul was going to drop dead. Yeah. Danny began to laugh. Wallace was pointing to his Thalberg Award, to his Oscar, and he had to laugh too. He says, go ahead, start at the beginning. So I did a rewrite on Mrs. Leslie, and I shared the credit with Miss Frings.
Yes.
For this. It was a successful show.
Yeah.
So shortly after that, he came to me with the rose tattoo. He said, can you put this on the screen for us? And I had to start with page 1 and do a screenplay there.
And that was Burt Lancaster and
Anna Magnani.
Anna Magnani.
And Magnani, of course, won the Academy Award. And again, it was Danny Mann who directed it.
Yes.
Now, after I did the first draft of the screenplay, and I had tremendous battles with the office, the Breen office at the time,
Oh, yeah.
you know, censorship, because there were a lot of things that you couldn't do or they didn't want us to do. And actually, one amusing anecdote, there was a gentleman named Jack Vizard, I believe, who worked for the Breen office at the time, and he was going over some material that I had written, and he pointed out one thing. I've forgotten what it was. He said, "You can't get by with this." He said, "This is, you know, the Catholic Church would not approve of things like this. You have to get rid of it. You have to do some euphemistic work here." He said, "You people are always trying to pull things over on us." He said, "I remember one writer had written something he thought he'd get by with, but we caught it." I said, "What was that?" He said, "Just a line of description." I said, "Well, what was the line?" He said, "From OS, a scream from a naked woman." I said, "I'm glad you caught that."
And of course, that's off stage. Yeah. Right.
OS, off stage or
Yeah.
off screen, right?
Now, during that time, Hal,
Yeah.
you mentioned Martin and Lewis.
Yeah.
Now, Hal Wallace was their first producer. They had
Correct.
come out of the nightclub circuit, and they were a very hot young team.
Correct.
And you wrote a couple of pictures for them?
Yes.
Yeah. What were they?
I did one called Money from Home.
Right.
And another one, I worked with some other writers on Artists and Models, I believe.
Oh,
was
yes.
one of them.
Right, right.
And then there was another one, I think that Don McGuire wrote that I did some work on with, called the Big Circus or something like that. I've forgotten what it was.
Yeah.
But,
They were tremendously popular pictures.
Yes.
And they were such a hot team.
yes, they were.
And they went from those successes into the Colgate Comedy Hour and their their television successes. Did you do any other work for Hal Wallace, any other adaptations or anything?
Much later, I came back to Wallace, and I wrote a script called Loving You, and
yes.
I also directed that.
Right.
That was the first starring role for Elvis Presley.
Right, right.
And that was an interesting and a lovely experience.
What was Presley like to work with?
He was a gentleman.
Yeah.
He was a lot of fun, and hard worker, and conscientious, and a sweet man.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed working with him. Of course, this is very early in his career.
Yes. Yeah.
He was thin then, and I had hair.
Now the songs, of course, as always on a movie set, or pre-recorded, and then he
Yes.
lip-synced
Yes,
to
true.
them. Now, were there a lot of songs in that film?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Any Presley picture has to have a lot of songs.
Yeah, sure, sure.
I did two of those. I did after I did Loving You.
Yeah.
A year or so later, I did another one called Blue Hawaii.
Oh yes.
Which
yeah.
is, I think, was the biggest his biggest grosser.
Now, was this before Presley went into the service?
Yes.
Yeah.
No. Loving You was before he went into the service.
Right.
Blue Hawaii was immediately after he came out of the service.
I see. Yeah.
I did not direct Blue Hawaii.
Yeah. Blue Hawaii was what, a touch more serious than the other comedies. Am I right?
Not necessarily.
I see.
No,
Okay.
they're both pretty frothy kind of. I think, as a matter of fact, I think Loving You had more serious stuff in it than Blue Hawaii.
I see. I see.
It was also probably the best job that Elvis did as an actor.
Yeah. Right. What was it like in terms of the conditions around the set and everything? Was there a mob around the place all the time?
There could have been, and frequently there was. When school was out, there were an awful lot of kids around.
Sure.
Every executive in town wanted to have access to the set and to meet Elvis.
Yeah.
And he was very good about that, by the way.
Yeah.
He was better about it than I was, because after a while it began to get on my nerves. I have to clear some of these people out of here. Let's get some work done.
Sure. What was his reaction? Was he pleased with the movie work? Did he feel that this was?
At the time, he seemed to be very pleased with it.
Yeah,
yes. His mother and father visited the set. I think their first trip to Hollywood.
Yeah.
And one evening we were shooting on the back lot at Paramount, night for night. And his parents, when we did wrap up the day shooting, his parents were there, and I said, "How would you like to get in the movies?" I said, "Why don't you just walk into the stage there and just stand there with Elvis and have a little chat, and we'll keep the show running, and we'll show you what you look like on the movie," which we did. And this is Vernon and his mother. I forget her name at the moment. The following day, we showed them the rushes, and they were delighted to see themselves on the screen.
Great.
And they were so pleased, I said, "Let's use them in the film itself." And there is a shot in Loving You, big audience, and they're sitting on the aisle where Elvis comes dancing down and singing, and you see his mother and his father clapping and going along.
Oh, that's great.
Now, the stuff that we shot that evening earlier is a very rare footage that somebody has somewhere, and nobody's been able to find it anywhere. So if anybody knows where it is, it's worth a fortune.
Somewhere at Paramount, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I was told later that after she died, his mother died, Elvis never wanted to see Loving You again. He's run all of his old films, but never Loving You.
Yeah. It was too much for him.
Too much to see his mother.
Yeah. But you think that footage is somewhere in a,
it is, I'm sure.
Can somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that you were headed for Hecht Hill, Lancaster. Is that?
After I think this I was on loan out from Wallace.
Right.
This was before Loving You, or before. I finished the screenplay, the first draft screenplay for The Rose Tattoo.
Right.
And I was very disappointed when Wallace said he was going to put Burt Lancaster in the part of Mangiacavallo.
Right.
I thought that Eli Wallach, the man I had seen play it on the stage, would be ideal for film. And Wallace said, no, nobody knows him. He said, and nobody knows Anna Magnani, the woman who's going to play Rosa. He said that I have to have somebody to bring people into the theater to see the film. He says, and Burt will do that. And okay, I can't argue with that. I can't argue with anything that Wallace said. But then I went on loan out from Wallace to Hecht Hill Lancaster. That was a group who was making a film called Vera Cruz.
And that Lancaster was, of course, Burt Lancaster.
Was Burt Lancaster. Yeah. And I was working in Burt's office at their little studio somewhere on Santa Monica Boulevard. And Hecht Hill, that was Harold Hecht, producer, James Hill, a writer, producer, and Burt Lancaster. Now, I had come in to work do some dialogue repair work on a script by James Webb.
Yes.
And Borden Chase.
Yeah. Yeah.
And all I had to do was throw in a few jokes here and there.
Yeah. Two very prominent screenwriters.
Yes,
yeah.
Of course. Two of the best. Now, Burt was preparing at the time to play Vera Cruz with Gary Cooper. And he was learning to use guns. And every day he would come into the office wearing a gun belt and 2 6-shooters, and he was twirling his guns and doing fast draws and putting them back into the... And he had an instructor named Rod Redwing, an Indian. And he would spend a half an hour with Rod doing that, and then the rest of the time he was asking me questions about the Rose Tattoo. He was much more interested in the Rose Tattoo and what he was going to, than he was in the Vera Cruz. Anyway, Vera Cruz turned out to be a hell of a movie, by the way. Yes. A big, very, very big success. Now the Rose Tattoo goes to New York, or Wallace went to New York, and Mr. Williams got the script and he blew his top. He was absolutely frustrated about the fact that so much of it has been changed. So I had to come back, go to New York to meet him and sit and work on making some other changes. Try to restore some of the work that had been taken out. I had to explain to him why a lot of changes have been made because of the Breen office. So Tom and I worked, as I said, Tom, I remember when we first met, after we first met, Danny Mann, who had worked with Williams, said he's very, very shy. He's very suspicious of strangers, and he doesn't like tall people. So I thought when I met him, I'll either fall to my knees or never stand. Anyway, we got along rather well because about an hour after the first meeting, he leaned over to me and said, I said, what do I call you, Mr. Williams or Tennessee? He said, my friends call me Tom. I said, okay, I'll call you Tom. So I called him Tom for a while. I finally went back to Mr. Williams. We worked a couple of hours every day. He'd write a scene, and I'd write a scene. We'd exchange scenes and go over it that way. We finally arrived to where we got a reasonably workable script. And one afternoon, he called and said, I'm sorry, I can't meet you this afternoon. He said, because my bulldog died, and I've got to go out and buy a new one. Another time, he said, you know, I was watching that McCarthy hearings. He said, that man is he's just giving me fits. He said, he's like a circuit-riding preacher from down south. He said, just evil man, evil, that McCarthy. He said, I was so upset the way he treated our friend Arthur Miller. He said, I sat down and wrote a letter defending Arthur Miller to that House Un-American Activities Committee. He said that I wrote a brilliant, absolutely brilliant letter. He says, and this was in Key West I did this. And I went down to the post office to mail it. He says, and I just about to put it in the mailbox, and I said to myself, Thomas Lanier Williams, what are you doing getting mixed up with things with no business of yours? He says, so I withdrew the letter from the mailbox and tore it up and threw it away.
Oh, boy.
That was Tom
That
Williams.
was Tennessee.
Yeah, Tennessee. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, much later, after we made the film, Danny Mann said to me, "I got a great compliment for you." I said, "What is that?" No. First, I must tell you this. Williams had also done A Streetcar Named Desire. Oscar Saul had done an adaptation of that. And he had the same experience, Oscar had the same experience that I had, is that he absolutely railed against giving him credit for this on the script, on the screen. So Oscar got adaptation credit too. The same thing with my script, even though I had done a major rewrite on it in adapting it to the screen. He did say that it's not my work, it's his work. And by that time, I was very successful doing the George Gobel show, so I didn't argue about the screen credit. I probably should have gone to the Guild and said, let the Guild make this decision. But in those days, you could say, okay, I'll accept that. I accepted the adaptation credit. Now, they do the picture, and Danny said, I have a compliment for you. I said, what is that? He said, I showed the picture to Tom and to Tennessee, as he called him. He said, and after the lights came up, he said, you know, he said, the best scene in this whole thing isn't even mine. He said, isn't that a great compliment? I said, what's such a great compliment? I said, the son of a bitch didn't even mention my name.
You were working on the George Gobel show during this time.
No, I did the at the end of the assignment with I think with after Vera Cruz.
Right.
I was asked to do the Gobel show.
Yeah.
And I'd wanted to direct, and Paramount or Wallace would not give me the opportunity to direct. The Gobel show gave me the opportunity, so I said, okay, I'll do television.
Right.
And it was a very good move on my part, because I did it and was very happy with my association with George, and also very happy with the work that we turned out.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a class act all the way. Where did George Gobel come from?
Chicago.
He had not been in television before, except for guest shots, right?
Yeah, that's all.
Yeah. And did he come out of vaudeville, or what was
No, I believe he came out of, he was a child star. He was he used to play guitar and sing when he was a kid. He was a boy soprano, and he worked on Grand Ole Opry, I believe it was, a National Barn Dance. That was it. Yeah. And then during the war, he became an entertainer for the troops. Although he was a lieutenant, he was a flight instructor in Oklahoma, And he began entertaining the troops, and when he got out of the Army, somebody put him in, just put him on the stage.
Yeah, yeah.
And he did very well.
He was a national rage there for a while.
He was indeed.
Yeah. Now this big television success that you had, of course, led to others, to specials that you produced. And did you continue with Martin and Lewis in their television work?
No, I did not.
Yeah, yeah.
No.
But you went from the George Gobel show, you went to other event type shows in television. Didn't you produce some specials?
Yes, I did. But earlier I had started doing the Academy Awards when I was at Paramount, you know, as a writer.
Right.
But that was in radio. We were still doing radio.
Yes, yes.
I can't recall. You know, I'd have to sit down and figure
Yes,
out
yeah,
now exactly
sure,
what that
sure.
what the chronology is there.
When you went to another television show that for many reasons had a tremendous impact, and that was Julia with Diane Carroll. And Diane Carroll, as an African-American woman, this was an extraordinary event in television, and you handled it very lightly in a comedy mood without pounding on the fact. How did that get on the air? How did Julia get on the air?
First of all, let's go back for a moment. Jack Valenti gave a luncheon for a man named Roy Wilkins, who was then the president of the NAACP, and he invited a group of people to meet Mr. Wilkins. And after lunch, Wilkins spoke very movingly about the plight of the black man in American entertainment, and also particularly about television, that blacks were not represented on the screen. And as I went home, I was so impressed by what he had to say. I was thinking, there's something I must be able to do to help that situation, because I had in my radio days been guilty of committing 2 black radio shows on the public. One of them was Amos and Andy, which was really a remarkably funny show, and then a series called Beulah, with Hattie McDaniel playing a maid. So I thought maybe I can do something to help the black person in television. And I got the idea of a beautiful black woman trying to raise a young child by herself. I didn't discuss it with anybody. I just sat down and wrote a script. I gave the script to my agent, who at that time was the George Rosenberg agency, and Meta, his wife, Meta Rosenberg, read the script one night, called me around midnight. She said, "I'm sorry to call you at this hour." She says, "But I just picked up that script and read it." She says, "I'm absolutely thrilled by it." She says, "It was wonderful. It's absolutely great." She says, "It's got to be on the air." I said, "I'm willing. You can wake me up anytime you want to tell me things like that." And she said, "We've got to," she said, "however," she said, "we can't show it to anybody here in California." She said, "There's nobody here who has the power to say, yes, put it on the air. The people out here have the power of no. Very few of them had the power of yes." She had to go back east, and she took it to Mort Werner, who was then head of programming at NBC. He read it. He loved it. He said, "Let's go." And we made it. We then made a deal with 20th Century Fox, and we shot the film there. While we were shooting the film, people went out trying to get some sponsors lined up. Nobody would touch it at the moment. finally we finished the script, finished the shooting rather, and Diane Carroll was so magnificent. The two kids, black and white boys, were so charming, so enchanting, that the show was immediately grabbed by the first person they showed it to, and that was General Motors. Now we had to fight the local stations to get it on the air, and most of the stations took it on, except in the South. There was a lot of problems in the South. They wouldn't take it on the air. The show went on. It got an absolute rave from everybody who saw it. Within 3 weeks, it was like in the top 5 on the Nielsen's, and every station in the South that had turned it down had to come on and picked up the show.
Very good. Now that was the background too. Also, Hal, was that Nat Cole, some years earlier, had done a musical variety show, which was
killed by the South.
Exactly.
And Sammy Davis Jr. also had trouble with his show. He never got off the air, got off the ground with his show either. Yeah. But Julia did open the it opened the doors for all the black shows to follow.
Yes. And I think the reason possibly was that you treated it as a woman trying to raise a child alone, period.
That's right, yes.
And I think that playing a featured role in that was Lloyd Nolan, was that correct?
Lloyd was a co-star, actually. Lloyd played the doctor for whom she goes to work.
Yes. Yeah.
And also in the cast was Lorene Tuttle, who played the head nurse.
Yes.
And Julia, of course, played a registered nurse.
Yeah.
Then the two children were absolutely astonishing. Another thing about that show, it didn't have a laugh track.
Yeah.
And I remember when we showed the rough cut to the network people. They came out from New York to look at it. And when the lights went up, I said, well, what do you think? You know, waiting for somebody to say something. And finally somebody said, I think it was Mort, said, for some reason I thought it would be funnier. I said, what do you mean funnier? He said, well, I missed the laughs. Maybe we should put a laugh track in. I said, well, I don't want to put a laugh track in because I think that people are going to laugh at different places here. I don't think we should tell them where to laugh. Let them laugh on their own. I said, for instance, there's a scene where the black boy and the white boy meet, and they meet the black boy's mother. And little Earl J. Ragadon, the white guy, said to Corey Baker, the black boy, he said, is that your mother? And Corey says, yeah, that's her. He says, you know what? And Corey says, what? He says, your mother's colored. He says, yeah. He says, so am I. and Earl says, you are? He says, yeah. He says, oh boy. And they threw their arms around each other and began wrestling. I said, now, I tell you what, gentlemen, they said, you tell me where the laugh goes there. I said, does it go, you know what? He says, your mother's colored. He says, oh yeah? Or where? He says, so am I? He says, where does the laugh go? And nobody could answer. Yeah. So I won my case, and the show went on without a laugh track. It was interesting, though, that same scene was shown for a whole group of people at the Television Academy when they had their preview. Every year they take a preview of what the new season's like, and that's one of the scenes they showed. And the people screamed at that so loud, you didn't hear the rest of the time.
But that was extremely rare for a comedy to go on the air without a laugh track.
It was indeed.
And is rare today.
Except that now when they remade they recut the picture for syndication. They had to take out a minute, I think, of each episode, and they added a laugh track to it.
Oh boy.
And I just can't even look at it anymore.
Yeah, yeah. Now, you went on to do Valentine's Day.
I think Valentine's Day was before.
Was it before Julia?
Before
Excuse
Julia,
me.
yes.
That was Tony Franciosa.
Tony Franciosa and Jack Soo.
And Jack Soo. Now, Jack Soo was a gentleman who played the houseman for Tony Franciosa.
Correct.
And Jack Soo had some extraordinarily witty lines throughout the run of that series. And I always thought in watching that show that Jack Soo was Hal Kanter.
I always thought that Jack Soo was Phil Harris.
Oh.
I swear. He was, Jack, it's interesting about that. Jack was playing in Las Vegas in Flower Drum Song.
Right.
When Maurice Morton from Fox and
Yes.
I went to Las Vegas to present him with a script and see if he would do it. And when I told him what it was about, he said, no. He says, I don't play a houseboy, I can't do that. I said, why don't you read the script? And the one line, he says, Sue, whatever his name was, Rocky. He mixes martinis for two, and then sits down
And has one with him.
has them with.
Yeah.
Then when he saw the relationship of these two people,
Yeah.
he said, yeah, "I'll do it."
He was very, very popular in that show, and he died young, didn't he? He died prematurely.
Yes, he was, but he became a big hit on Barney Miller.
Yes,
Subsequently,
that's right. That's right.
Unfortunately, he did die too early.
Yeah. But you had a way of writing the lines for him.
Oh, he was a wonderful character to write
Yeah,
for.
yeah.
I enjoyed that.
Very, very sarcastic kind of put-down lines that were really well enjoyed. Did Valentine's Day have a laugh track?
I believe so.
Yeah.
I believe it did, yeah.
It was just so rare that that there wasn't any at all. It was an extremely rare experience. Hal, you wrote and you produced a very unusual dramatic series starring Jimmy Stewart. I don't believe he had done any television prior to that except guest shots. Is that correct?
That's true. He, as a matter of fact, one of his first things he ever did in television was a guest shot on the George Gobel show.
Oh, right.
And of course, I had worked with Jimmy in radio. I did one of the things we overlooked is the whole year, the 5 years I did the radio show for Bing Crosby, and during that period, I worked with probably every actor who can read a script, which includes many members of the Guild, by the way. When Jimmy Stewart decided that he would do television, they asked a number of people to come up with ideas, and they called me. I was then working at Warner Brothers. Asked me if I had an idea for Jimmy Stewart, and I said, no, I don't. I said, but give me 5 minutes, and I'll have one.
Yeah.
We went in. Herb Schlosser, who was then the head of television for NBC, and another gentleman and I went in to see Jimmy and his agents at his agent's office. And I described to him what I had in mind. It was not a dramatic show, incidentally. That came later. It was a comedy.
Right.
It was a comedy of generations, Jimmy and
Oh, yes.
and his grandchildren.
Right.
And it was based on Margaret Mead's observation that grandchildren and grandparents get along well because they have a common enemy. So this show was based on that. And Jimmy enjoyed what I had prepared for him. Anyway, as we left the the meeting that morning, Herb Schlosser said to me, gee, he said, he looks old, doesn't he? I said, yeah. He said, how old is he? I said, I think he's about 63, 64. He said, how old do you suppose he'll photograph? I said, about 73 or 74. And he got along. He said, boy, that's old. I said, yeah, that is. I said, but Herb, I said, just remember this. He's the only old Jimmy Stewart there is in the world. We did the show. For the part of the wife, he wanted his own wife, Gloria, to play the wife on the air, and NBC would not allow it. They turned her down. So we brought in, we made a lot of tests, and we wound up with a very lovely actress, Julie Adams, and we did the series. But Jimmy never forgot the fact that they had turned down Gloria to begin with. And at the end of the season, he did not want to go back, and he didn't. And we did only one season of the Jimmy Stewart Show. He later came back in another series called, I think, Hawkins or something like that.
The 1 hour?
That David Karp did.
Oh, that's right.
And it was an hour about a lawyer, I believe, a small-town lawyer.
Yeah. Did he adapt well to the short schedules?
Jimmy is a remarkably competent actor.
Yeah.
He adapted extremely well, and he learns his lines. He shows up on the set at the appointed time, and he knows what he's doing.
Yeah.
He really understands film.
Yeah.
We did not get along politically, but we did get along artistically.
Yes. Yeah. So you didn't bring up those sore points on.
Tried not to.
Yeah. Yeah. That was Jimmy Stewart's first series then?
Yes, it was.
Yeah. Was he happy about that? Did he see it as a?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I can never tell. I do know that he had some very rigid ideas about a lot of things. You know, when you talk about dealing with Jimmy Stewart, the first thing you have to remember, you're dealing with a major general in the United States Air Force.
Yes.
Not a major, a brigadier.
Yeah.
But he was a general.
Yeah.
He also has a very delightful, impy sense of humor. I remember when before we began shooting, my book, the first book I wrote, had just come out. I'd gotten an advance copy of it. It was sitting on my desk, and I showed it to him, and he looked. I said, "Oh boy!" I said, "Just a minute." And he got up and he left, and he came back, and he didn't have the book. I said, "Where'd you go?" He says, "I put the book in my car." I said, "Jimmy, that's the first edition, the first copy, and that's mine." He says, "Oh, I'm sorry about that." And he went out and returned.
Yeah, yeah.